The broadcast was designed to break us. Trillions across the galaxy tuned in to watch the Kalan Ascendancy execute Earth's most decorated commander. They expected him to beg. They expected a display of human frailty. Instead, as the executioner's blade powered up, the bruised and battered human just smiled. By the year 2142, humanity had learned that the universe was not just cold and indifferent, it was actively hostile. When the Kalan Ascendancy first arrived in the Sol system, they didn't send diplomats, they sent dreadnoughts. They were a species of towering obsidian-scaled bipeds whose empire spanned 3 galaxies. To them, humanity was merely a localized infestation, a primitive civilization that had barely managed to harness nuclear fusion and was still reliant on corporate defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to build our orbital defense grids. The Kalans shattered those grids in less than 48 hours. The war had raged for 6 agonizing years. Earth was heavily battered but unbroken, surviving only through the sheer, stubborn tenacity that had defined our species since we first threw rocks at predators in the dark. We weaponized everything. When the Kalan disabled our plasma batteries, we rammed them with kinetic strike satellites built by SpaceX and Boeing. When they jammed our quantum communicators, we went back to hardwired fiber optics and laser-tight beams. But despite our resilience, we were losing. We were being pushed back to the asteroid belt, then to Mars, and finally to the lunar defense perimeter. It was during the fall of the Kepler sector that Captain Nathaniel Reed was captured. Reed was a legend. He had commanded the time's UNS Dauntless, a retrofitted heavy cruiser that had single-handedly held the line at the Orion Nebula, buying enough time for 3 civilian transport ships to escape a Kalan blockade. Reed was the archetypal human soldier, pragmatic, fiercely loyal, and dangerously unpredictable. When his ship was finally crippled, its engines burning out in a spectacular fusion overload, Reed didn't surrender. He fought boarding parties hand-to-hand in the zero-gravity corridors of his dying ship until he was buried under the bodies of alien shock troops and subdued by neuroparalytics. For the Kalan, capturing Reed was a monumental victory. They didn't just want to kill a human commander, they wanted to kill human hope. The Kalan Grand Arbiter, a ruthless tactician named Vorel, decreed that Reed's execution would not be a quiet affair. It would be a spectacle. The Ascendancy utilized a tachyon-based communication network that linked thousands of conquered worlds. Vorel ordered that Reed's execution be broadcast live, unconditionally, to every screen, every neural link, and every public frequency across the galaxy. He wanted the subjugated species of the Ascendancy to watch. More importantly, he wanted Earth to watch. He wanted the billions of terrified humans huddled in subterranean bunkers in London, New York, Tokyo, and New Geneva to see their greatest hero brought to his knees. The broadcast was a psychological weapon, precision-engineered to shatter the human spirit. The message was clear. This is your best. Look at how easily he breaks. What the Kalans didn't know, however, was that humanity had recognized the end was near months ago. At a highly classified, off-the-books black site managed by DARPA and the remnants of Boston Dynamics' bioengineering division, Admiral Benjamin Croft and a team of Earth's most ruthless pragmatists had developed a contingency. It was a plan so dark, so wildly dangerous, that only a man who was already dead could execute it. As the tachyon broadcast flared to life across the galaxy, overriding every frequency and dominating every screen, the stage was set. The Kalan capital world of Ethelgard, a sprawling metropolis of crystalline spires and floating anti-gravity platforms, basked in the artificial light of a dozen stadium-sized holographic projectors. The galaxy was watching. Earth was watching. And Nathaniel Reed was exactly where he needed to be. The holding cell was a sterile, featureless void of blinding white light, designed to disorient and break the mind of anyone trapped inside. Reed had been kept in sensory deprivation for what he guessed was 3 weeks. His body was a tapestry of violence. The Kalan interrogators had fractured his ribs, shattered his left orbital bone, and stripped him of his combat armor, leaving him in a ragged, blood-stained gray jumpsuit. They had tried to extract the operational codes for Earth's final planetary shield. Reed had given them nothing but a fractured smile and a recipe for his grandmother's apple pie, recited in painstaking, agonizing detail. When the massive blast doors of his cell finally hissed open, the sudden rush of cold air and noise hit him like a physical blow. 4 Kalan guards, each standing 8 feet tall and clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered like liquid silver, entered the room. They didn't speak. They grabbed Reed by the chains, bound his wrists, and dragged him to his feet. Reed's boots scraped against the crystalline floor as he was marched down a long, echoing corridor. His breathing was heavy, ragged. Every step sent a jolt of white-hot pain up his spine, but he forced himself to stand upright. He would not give them the satisfaction of a limp. "Move, human," one of the guards hissed through a translation collar, the mechanical voice devoid of emotion. I'm going, Reed rasped, his voice rough like sandpaper. "No need to be pushy. You guys really need to learn how to host." The corridor opened up into the grand amphitheater, an architectural marvel that could seat 1,000,000 spectators. But today, the physical seats were secondary. Hovering above the arena were thousands of massive orbital drones, each equipped with tachyon lenses, broadcasting the event across the cosmos. As Reed stepped out into the blinding glare of the artificial suns illuminating the arena, a sound washed over him, a low, thunderous hum. It was the sound of 1,000,000 Kalan citizens murmuring in anticipation. The broadcast went live. On Earth, billions of people stopped breathing. In the bunkers, beneath the ruins of Paris, refugees huddled around flickering, battery-powered monitors. In the command centers of Cheyenne Mountain, generals stared in grim silence at the main tactical screens. They saw their captain. They saw the blood dried on his face, the way his left eye was swollen shut, the chains heavy on his shoulders. A collective wave of despair rippled through the human race. The Kalan had won. They had taken the unyielding spirit of humanity and dragged it in chains before the universe. In the center of the arena stood the execution block, a raised platform made of black, light-absorbing metal. Standing atop it was High Inquisitor Vorel. Vorel was an imposing figure, even among his own kind. Draped in crimson robes, his face covered by a ceremonial golden mask. In his massive, clawed hand, he held the Ascendancy's chosen instrument of death, a zero-point plasma scythe, capable of severing a body at the molecular level. It was a weapon meant for theater as much as execution. Reed walked. It felt like miles. The chains rattled, the only sound piercing the sudden, suffocating silence of the arena. The camera drone zoomed in, capturing every drop of sweat, every twitch of pain on his battered face. The feed was completely unencrypted, a high-definition stream of humanity's impending humiliation. Just a little further, Reed thought, his mind crystal clear despite the agony radiating through his body. Keep them focused on you. Keep the cameras rolling. The Kalans thought they were orchestrating a display of absolute dominance. But as Reed looked up at the floating camera drones, he didn't see an audience of conquerors. He saw a network. A vast, interconnected web of data streams linking every Kalan dreadnought, every planetary defense grid, and every command center back to this exact moment. By demanding that the execution be broadcast unconditionally across their entire military and civilian network, Vorel had created the most robust, unfiltered data bridge in galactic history. Reed reached the steps of the platform. The guards shoved him hard, sending him sprawling onto the cold black metal. He tasted copper as his split lip tore open again. "On your knees, pest," the god snarled. Reed slowly pushed himself up, resting on his bruised knees. He looked up at Vorel. The High Inquisitor loomed over him, the plasma scythe humming with a terrifying, high-pitched whine. The air around the blade distorted with the sheer heat of the confined energy. "Humanity," Vorel's voice boomed, amplified by the arena's acoustics, and beamed directly into the minds of trillions via the tachyon feed. "Look upon your champion. Look upon the frailty of your species. You fight against the inevitable tide of the ascendancy. You resist, like insects thrashing against a storm. Today, the storm breaks you." Earth watched in devastated silence. Admiral Croft, standing in the subterranean DARPA command center, gripped the edge of a console until his knuckles turned white. "Is the uplink stable?" Croft whispered to the technician beside him. "Stable, sir," the technician replied, his voice trembling. "They gave us the keys to their entire network. The tachyon feed is a two-way street, just like Dr. Henderson hypothesized." Back in the arena, Vorel raised the scythe. Let this be the final lesson to the Terran system. Your heroes bleed, your heroes die, and in the end, they always beg. Voral looked down at Reed, expecting the human to break. He expected tears. He expected a frantic plea for mercy, a final, desperate attempt to cling to life. Instead, Nathaniel Reed did the exact opposite. Reed looked up at the towering alien executioner, glanced at the glowing plasma blade, and let out a low, raspy chuckle. The sound was jarring. In an arena built for millions, currently gripped by dead silence, the human's laughter echoed like a gunshot. Voral paused, the scythe hovering just inches above Reed's neck. "You find your demise amusing, human?" Voral demanded, his booming voice laced with genuine confusion. The camera drones instantly zeroed in on Reed's face, projecting it 10 stories high in the arena and onto billions of screens across the galaxy. Reed coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and then grinned. It wasn't a forced smile of bravado, nor the manic grin of a broken mind. It was a cold, predatory smile. It was the smile of a chess player who had just forced checkmate in 5 moves and was waiting for his opponent to realize it. "No," Reed rasped, his voice carrying clearly through the open mics. "I find times you times amusing. I find your arrogance hilarious. You really think I got captured by accident?" A ripple of murmurs washed through the amphitheater. On Earth, people leaned closer to their screens, tears drying on their faces, replaced by bewildered shock. Voral's grip on the scythe tightened. "You fought until your ship was a tomb. You were dragged here in chains. Do not attempt to feign control. Pest." "Oh, Voral," Reed sighed, shaking his head slowly as if disappointed in a child. "You aliens and your tech. You rely so much on your tachyon networks, your interconnected defense grids. You wanted this broadcast to go everywhere, right? Direct line to every Kalan ship, every outpost, every orbital cannon. It is a testament to our power," Voral sneered. "No," Reed said, the smile widening, exposing blood-stained teeth. "It's a giant, unfirewalled back door." Before he deployed to the Kepler sector, Reed had sat in a sterilized medical bay in Nevada, surrounded by DARPA engineers and neurospecialists. They didn't give him a new weapon or stronger armor. Dr. Walter Henderson, the lead cybernetics architect, had surgically implanted a microfilament node directly into Reed's cerebral cortex. It wasn't a bomb, it was a transceiver. Coded into the very synapses of Reed's brain was Archangel, the most devastating, virulent cyber weapon humanity had ever conceived. Heavily reverse-engineered from captured Kalan tech by a joint task force of Lockheed Martin and Cyber Command. But Archangel was too massive, too complex to be transmitted via standard human satellites. It needed a carrier wave strong enough to bypass Kalan quantum encryption. It needed a tachyon broadcast. By forcing a live, unencrypted, bi-directional feed to humiliate the human race, the Kalan had unknowingly established the very connection Earth needed. They had plugged their entire military infrastructure directly into Nathaniel Reed's head. "You wanted a show," Reed whispered, his eyes locking on to the nearest camera drone. He wasn't speaking to Voral anymore. He was speaking to the Kalan Emperor watching from his palace. He was speaking to the human fleet waiting in the dark. "So let's give them a show." Reed closed his eyes. The physiological trigger was tied to his heart rate and an intentional, localized spike in his prefrontal cortex, a spike induced by a specific meditative focus. Deep within his skull, the DARPA node activated. To the Kalan in the arena, nothing seemed to happen at first. Voral, losing his patience, let out a furious roar. "Enough of your babble! Die, human!" Voral swung the plasma scythe down with blinding speed. But the blade didn't connect. A foot above Reed's neck, the scythe sputtered, the confinement field collapsing in a shower of harmless blue sparks. Voral stumbled forward, staring in disbelief at the deactivated hilt of his weapon. "What? What is this?" Voral stammered. Above them, the massive holographic projectors surrounding the arena flickered. The crystal-clear image of the execution was suddenly overtaken by jagged lines of static, and then the image shifted. The Ascendancy crest vanished. In its place, the emblem of the United Nations Space Command flared onto the screens, cast in a defiant blazing gold. A klaxon alarm began to shriek in the distance. Then another, and another. "Inquisitor!" A Kalan technician screamed from a command booth overlooking the arena. "Sir, We are experiencing system-wide cascading failures. The orbital defense grid is powering down. Voral spun around, his golden mask reflecting the flashing red emergency lights that were suddenly illuminating the amphitheater. Impossible. Switch to backup generators. Isolate the network. We can't. The technician's voice was sheer panic now. It's coming through the tachyon broadcast. It's in the communication nodes. The dreadnoughts in orbit. Their engines are cutting out. The life support systems on the outer colonies. Reed slowly got to his feet. The chains around his wrists clattered against the black metal platform. The agonizing pain in his body was drowned out by the sheer surge of adrenaline. He looked at Voral, whose imposing figure suddenly seemed much smaller. I told you, Voral, Reed said, his voice echoing through the chaos. I didn't lose that battle. I just needed a ride to the capital. And you were kind enough to pay the fare. Across the galaxy, the Archangel virus propagated at faster-than-light speeds. It was a digital plague tailored specifically to Kalan architecture. On dreadnoughts enforcing blockades around human worlds, weapon batteries went dead. Planetary shields protecting Kalan, military installations flickered and collapsed. Navigational computers wiped their own databases, leaving massive alien armadas stranded in deep space. On Earth, the atmosphere in the bunkers shifted from absolute despair to electrifying disbelief. Admiral Croft slammed his fist on the console. Archangel is away! The Kalan grid is down! I repeat, their grid is down. All fleets, this is command. Execute Operation Icarus. Give them hell. From the dark side of Earth's moon, from the rings of Saturn, and from the shadowy craters of Mars, the remnants of humanity's fleet surged forward. Engines flared to life. Without the Kalan orbital defense grids to stop them, human interceptors and heavy cruisers punched through the atmosphere, tearing into the paralyzed alien ships with decades of pent-up fury. Back on Ethelgard, total pandemonium had erupted. The millions of spectators in the amphitheater were panicking, rushing the exits as the artificial suns above them began to dim, plunging the stadium into twilight. Kalan guards were desperately trying to manually reboot their weapons, slapping their rifles in futile frustration. Voral dropped the useless plasma scythe. He looked at Reed, genuine terror bleeding through his alien features for the first time. The human was battered, bruised, and unarmed, but as he stood in the center of the collapsing Kalan Empire, he looked like a god of war. Reed raised his chained hands, bringing them up to his face. You wanted to broadcast an execution to the whole galaxy, Voral, Reed said, the predatory smile returning. You just got the wrong victim. Voral's initial shock evaporated, replaced by a violent, unadulterated rage. He was an apex predator, a high inquisitor of a galactic empire, and he had just been humiliated on a cosmic scale by a bruised primate. You think a mere computer virus can defeat the Ascendancy? Voral bellowed, his voice raw and echoing off the crystalline walls of the descending darkness. The arena's artificial suns had fully powered down, leaving only the crimson glow of emergency klaxons slicing through the shadows. I will tear you apart with my bare hands. Voral lunged. He was 8 feet of muscle and armored scales, moving with a speed that belied his massive frame. But Nathaniel Reed was no longer just a battered prisoner. The DARPA implant in his cortex wasn't merely a transmitter for the Archangel virus. It was intrinsically tied to his biological systems. To ensure Reed survived the excruciating pain of the data transfer, the microfilament node flooded his bloodstream with synthetic epinephrine and heavily classified combat stimulants synthesized by a Black Ops medical division. Time seemed to dilate for Reed. The agonizing pain in his fractured ribs dulled to a distant ache. As Voral's massive clawed hand swept down to crush his skull, Reed threw his weight to the side, rolling across the cold black metal of the execution block. He didn't try to run. He weaponized his restraints. Gripping the heavy, dense alloy chains that still bound his wrists together, Reed used the momentum of his roll to whip the metal links upward. The heavy chain caught Voral directly across his golden ceremonial mask. The impact shattered the ornamental gold, sending shards flying and exposing the Kalan's reptilian, flat-nosed face. Dark blue blood sprayed across the platform. Voral staggered back, roaring in pain. I don't need a virus to defeat you, Voral, Reed spat, his chest heaving as he wrapped the excess chain around his knuckles like brutal brass knuckles. The virus is for your fleet. I brought these hands for you. Above them, the sky was tearing open. Because the Kalen orbital defense grid had gone entirely dark, the spatial anomaly detection systems were offline. There were no early warning sirens. There was only the sudden, violent rupture of real space as the human fleet arrived. Palantir's most advanced predictive quantum algorithms, running on massive server farms hidden beneath the Rocky Mountains, had calculated the exact jump coordinates. They didn't jump to the edge of the Ethelgard system. They didn't engage in a tactical slow-burn invasion. They jumped directly into the upper atmosphere of the Kalen capital world. The sky above the amphitheater ignited in a brilliant flash of Cherenkov radiation. Out of the blinding blue light emerged the Times UNS Vengeance, a massive supercarrier built by a joint coalition of Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics. It was a brutalist wedge of titanium and ablative armor, measuring over 3 miles long. And it wasn't alone. Hundreds of human destroyers, frigates, and heavy cruisers tore through the slipspace ruptures, dropping directly out of the sky like avenging angels. They were unbothered by atmospheric friction, their forward deflector shields burning bright orange as they plummeted toward the sprawling, unprotected alien metropolis. On the bridge of the Times Vengeance, Captain Sarah Mitchell watched the tactical readouts paint a picture of absolute, beautiful chaos. The Kalen dreadnoughts floating in orbit were completely dead in the water, their tachyon-linked engines paralyzed by the Archangel virus. "All batteries, this is Captain Mitchell," she barked into the comms, her eyes locked on the sprawling, crystalline palace of the Kalen Emperor. "Weapons free. Target their command centers. Target their orbital tethers. Show them what human artillery looks like." A barrage of kinetic penetrators, massive tungsten rods propelled by electromagnetic rails, rained down from the human ships. Unlike the Kalen, who relied on sophisticated plasma and energy weapons, humanity had stuck to the fundamental laws of physics. Mass multiplied by acceleration equals absolute devastation. The tungsten rods struck the floating anti-gravity platforms of Ethelgard with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. The concussive shockwaves shattered the crystalline spires of the city, sending thousands of tons of debris cascading down into the streets below. Back in the amphitheater, the ground quaked violently. The remaining Kalen guards, terrified and completely disconnected from their command network, began firing blindly into the sky with their sidearms, a futile gesture against the raining tungsten. But high above the city, in the heavily fortified citadel of the Ascendancy, Emperor Zarkor was not completely out of options. He stared at the holographic displays in his throne room, watching his empire crumble in real time. Archangel had infected 90% of their digital infrastructure, but the Kalen, for all their arrogance, had conquered 3 galaxies. They had not survived this long without a failsafe. "The digital realm is lost," Zarkor growled to his panic-stricken generals. "The human pest has poisoned the well. Initiate the Obsidian Protocol." The generals froze. "Emperor, the Obsidian Protocol will sever the primary data cores. It will cause localized tectonic destabilization. We will lose half the city." "Do it!" Zarkor roared. "It is an analog system. It is the only thing the virus cannot reach. If we physically sever the corrupted cores, the secondary planetary shields will reboot on isolated thermal generators. The human fleet will be trapped in our atmosphere, and we will crush them." Deep beneath the surface of Ethelgard, massive gears, purely mechanical, entirely devoid of network connectivity, began to turn. The Obsidian Protocol was a brute force hardware purge. In the amphitheater, Reed felt the shift. The microfilament node in his brain, still heavily intertwined with the remnants of the Kalen network, registered the sudden, violent analog severing of the data lines. The warning translated into a searing spike of pain behind his eyes. He stumbled, clutching his head. He knew exactly what was happening. If the Kalen managed to reboot their planetary shields on a closed-loop analog system, Captain Mitchell and the entire human fleet would be cut off from space, trapped in a cage with a wounded, desperate enemy. Vorel saw Reed stumble and seized the opportunity. He tackled Reed, driving his massive shoulder into the human's chest. They crashed off the black execution block and tumbled onto the crystalline floor of the arena. Vorel pinned Reed down, his clawed hands wrapping around Reed's throat, squeezing with enough force to crush steel. "You die now!" Vorel screamed, spit flying from his ruined face. "You die, and your fleet burns!" Reed's vision began to tunnel. Black spots danced at the edges of his sight. The DARPA stims were fighting the lack of oxygen, but brute strength was winning. Reed couldn't outmuscle a Kalen, but human beings are the ultimate masters of using their environment. Reed's right hand blindly flailed across the debris on the ground, his fingers brushing against the deactivated hilt of Voral's plasma scythe. The weapon's confinement field had been shorted out by the virus, but the power cell in the hilt was still heavily charged. Reed grabbed the heavy hilt. He didn't try to turn it on. Instead, he jammed the bottom of the hilt directly into the shattered, bleeding gap in Voral's golden mask, right where the Kalen's jaw met his neck. With his last ounce of oxygen, Reed slammed his palm against the emergency manual vent release on the weapon's power cell. A localized blast of raw, uncontained plasma vented directly into Voral's neck. The Kalen Inquisitor shrieked, a horrific, gurgling sound, as the hyperheated gas flash-boiled his flesh. Voral's grip slackened instantly, and the massive alien collapsed sideways, smoke pouring from his ruined throat. Reed gasped, rolling over and coughing violently as precious air flooded his crushed windpipe. He didn't have time to recover. The ground was shaking harder now. The Obsidian protocol was engaging. He had to find the local analog relay. Dragging himself to his feet, Reed stripped a kinetic sidearm from a dead guard and staggered toward the maintenance corridors beneath the amphitheater, leaving the dying executioner behind. While Reed descended into the bowels of the arena, the sky above shattered completely. General Robert King stood in the drop bay of the Times UNS Vengeance, looking down through the atmospheric shields at the sprawling alien city. King was a veteran of the Mars campaigns, a man who preferred his boots on the ground rather than giving orders from an orbital armchair. "The tachyon feed is still broadcasting," King said over the localized tactical net, addressing the hundreds of heavily armored helljumpers standing in the launch tubes beside him. "The whole galaxy is watching us right now. They watched Captain Reed bleed for them. Let's show them what happens when you make humanity bleed. Drop pods away." A terrifying sound ripped through the sky over Ethelgard. Thousands of SpaceX Meteor-class drop pods, heavily armored, heat-shielded kinetic vehicles, were fired from the bellies of the human fleet. They didn't float down gracefully. They were shot out of magnetic railguns hurtling toward the surface at Mach 5. The citizens of Ethelgard looked up in absolute horror as the sky rained black iron. Dozens of drop pods targeted the amphitheater directly. They slammed into the massive stadium with the force of artillery shells, smashing through the crystalline seating tiers and cratering the floor of the arena. Before the dust could even settle, the explosive bolts on the pod doors blew outward. Human Marines poured out, clad in heavy-powered armor manufactured by Raytheon, holding magnetic accelerator rifles. They immediately laid down a devastating wall of suppression fire. The remaining Kalen Royal Guards, trained for ceremonial combat and absolute dominance, were completely unprepared for the chaotic, hyper-aggressive shock and awe tactics of human infantry. "Secure the perimeter!" General King roared, stepping out of his command pod, his heavy rifle chewing through Kalen armor like paper. "Find Captain Reed! He was last seen moving to the sublevels. Move, move, move!" Deep underground, Reed was losing his own private war. The stimulants were wearing off, and his body was rapidly failing. He had fought his way through 2 heavy blast doors and a squad of panicked engineers to reach the primary analog junction room beneath the arena. The junction was a massive, spinning cylinder of solid-state hardware, physically lowering into the planet's crust to sever the data cores. If it dropped fully into the housing, the Obsidian protocol would finalize, and the planetary shields would trap the human fleet. Reed dropped his empty sidearm. There were no digital consoles here to hack, no keyboards. It was a massive mechanical switchboard, heavily shielded. "I can't hack it," Reed thought, his vision blurring. "But I can fry it." The DARPA microfilament node in his brain was still active, still searching for a network to dump the remaining payload of the Archangel virus. Reed walked over to the massive power conduits feeding the mechanical gears. The cables were as thick as tree trunks, pulsing with raw electrical current. Reed raised his chained wrists. The dense alloy chains were highly conductive. "Henderson," Reed whispered, speaking to the doctor light years away who had built the device in his head, "I hope you insulated this damn node, because this is going to hurt." Reed wrapped his chains around the exposed copper-equivalent wiring of the primary conduit, and then, screaming through the sheer agony, he grabbed the grounding rail of the mechanical cylinder. He made himself the bridge. The electrical current surged through the chains, into his suit, and straight into his nervous system. The DARPA node in his head registered the massive influx of raw power and, attempting to protect the host, forcefully dumped the entirety of the Archangel virus's encrypted data mass directly into the analog power stream. The sheer volume of corrupted, hyper-compressed data acting as a localized electromagnetic pulse was too much for the unshielded analog circuitry to handle. Sparks showered the room. The massive mechanical cylinder shuddered, ground its gears against themselves, and seized violently. A deafening crack echoed through the chamber as the primary drive shaft snapped under the sudden torsion. The Obsidian protocol was dead. The shields would not reboot. Reed collapsed backward, his body smoking, his vision fading to complete black. The last thing he heard was the heavy thudding footsteps of human combat boots rushing down the corridor, and a voice shouting his name. "Captain! Captain Reed, hold on! Medic! Get a goddamn medic down here!" It was pilot Jack Harrison, leading a squad of Marines. They surrounded Reed, instantly applying biofoam to his burns and stabilizing his wildly erratic heart rate. Above ground, Captain Sarah Mitchell received the telemetry data. The analog purge had failed. The atmosphere was permanently open. "Target the Citadel," Mitchell ordered, her voice cold as ice. "End this." The Times, UNS Vengeance Times, reoriented its massive frame. The primary prow-mounted Mac cannon, a weapon usually reserved for shattering moons, hummed as it drew power from the ship's dual fusion reactors. Emperor Zarkor stood by the shattered windows of his throne room, watching the massive human ship align its sights directly on his palace. His invincible empire, built over thousands of years, had been completely dismantled in less than an hour. He didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The Times Vengeance Times fired. A blinding streak of white-hot kinetic energy crossed the sky in a fraction of a second. The tungsten slug struck the base of the Kalan Citadel. The impact was cataclysmic. The towering structure of crystal and obsidian simply vaporized at the point of impact, the sheer kinetic force ripping the upper echelons of the palace apart. The citadel crumbled, collapsing in on itself in a fiery explosion that lit up the darkened city like a second sun. With their emperor dead, their fleet paralyzed, and their capital city falling, the remaining Kalan forces across the planet dropped their weapons. The war was over. Hours later, the dust was still settling over Ethelgard. The human fleet maintained absolute air superiority, hovering ominously over the ruined metropolis. Down in the amphitheater, General King had set up a temporary forward operating base. The tachyon broadcast, miraculously, was still running. The automated orbital drones, powered by independent solar kinetic batteries, continued to film the arena. Trillions of beings across the galaxy, subjugated species, terrified Kalan colonists, and cheering humans were still watching. In the center of the arena, sitting on the edge of the black execution block where he was meant to die, was Nathaniel Reed. He was a mess. A field medic, Chief Engineer Anthony Peterson, had stabilized his burns and wrapped half his torso in synth bandages. Reed was pale, exhausted, and barely holding himself upright, but he was alive. General King walked up to him, handing Reed a canteen of water. "You did good, Captain. The DARPA node burned out completely. You're free and clear." Reed took a slow sip of the water, wincing as it went down his raw throat. He looked up at the hovering camera drones, their red recording lights still blinking steadily. "They're still watching." "You know," King said, following Reed's gaze. "The whole galaxy. The ascendancy is broken. The subjugated planets are already rising up. They just needed to see that the Kalan could bleed." Reed slowly pushed himself to his feet. King offered a hand to help, but Reed waved it away, standing on his own. He walked toward the nearest camera drone. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the human champion to speak, to declare humanity the new rulers of the cosmos, to claim the empire for Earth. Reed looked directly into the lens. His face was a map of scars and bruises, a testament to the absolute hell he had endured. He thought about the Kalan, about Voral's arrogance, about the alien belief that suffering was a weakness. He thought about the unyielding, terrifying resilience of the human spirit. Reed didn't offer a grand speech. He didn't threaten the remaining Kalan worlds. He just looked into the camera, gave that same cold, predatory smile that had terrified the High Inquisitor, and said 5 words that would be echoed across the stars for 1,000 years. "Don't ever count us out." He turned his back to the camera, and walked away into the ranks of the human Marines, leaving the ruins of an empire behind him. Humanity didn't just survive the darkest hour of the galaxy. We broke the very empire that sought to execute our hope on live television. If this thrilling sci-fi HFY story of tactical brilliance, relentless human spirit, and ultimate victory kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more epic, adrenaline-pumping stories of human survival against the stars.